Until midday on 6PR, this is Gareth Parker.
Now, Oliver Peterson did a really good job of covering this story yesterday, but it's important and I want to continue to follow it this morning. The prudential regulator made a fascinating speech yesterday, pretty concerning speech really, about the future of private health insurance. It found essentially that, a whole bunch of private health insurance funds are not sustainable. There may be as few as 3 nationwide private health insurers who could be viable within 2 years if they don't do something about growing costs and the gap between premiums and costs. He says that the private health insurance industry is complacently sitting there waiting for the government to bail them out. And then unless something changes, some of them are going to hit the wall. There was even a prospect of forced mergers. Now, my non-expert take on this seems to be that what we're going to see is a bunch of mergers or exits from the industry, and we'll be left with maybe 1 or 2 not-for-profit funds like HBF and HCF, and then maybe 3 or 4 major for-profit funds like, say, Medibank, NIB, Bupa. That might be about it. Now, you get to that situation and private health insurance all of a sudden starts to look like the banks. Is that going to be good for patients? Is there going to be any incentive at all for them to keep premiums down if there's less competition? That's my sort of uneducated view. I'd be interested to hear what my guest has to say. We've spoken to him about these issues in the past. He's the former head of the Private Health Insurance Administration Council. Shaun Gath, good morning.
G'day, Gareth. How you going?
Okay. You surprised by the content of this speech?
Look, not particularly. APRA have been making these sort of noises for probably 2 years now, so this is a bit of a culmination of a series of communications with the industry, getting increasingly more serious, I think, each time. And yesterday, I think, definitely ramped it up another notch or two. So, but I think you see it in a sequence of communications. They've been anxious for a little while, and that's obviously still the case. So,
what's the fundamental problem here?
Well, there's a lot to share around, I think, Gareth. The basic problem is that healthcare is expensive. That's really the fundamental issue. And private health insurers are in the unfortunate position of having to pay the bills for expensive healthcare. And they are also caught somewhat in a bit of a series of traps that are created by government policy, which give them very limited flexibility in terms of what they pay, particularly to different categories of healthcare providers. So you've got this kind of toxic combination of government policy really closing down the set of options that are available to private health insurers to actually try and restrict costs and therefore minimise premiums, and at the same time an inflow of increasing costs coming out of the health sector. And so everybody's unhappy, as you can see.
We'll come back to the issue of rising health costs in a moment, but how would you free up the insurers? How would you, free them up to do things to try and keep premiums down?
Well, that's a big question with lots of answers, and in fact, in my view, Gareth, I think as I've told you on previous occasion, the better person to ultimately answer that question would be the Productivity Commission in a big and complicated and multi-layered report. But a few things that are obvious are in the prosthetics area, which accounts for about 15% of the total amount. At the moment, the insurers are obliged to pay an amount that is quite well above the true market rate because of a deal that's been done and is not going to change for a couple of years, and they're just locked into paying inflated costs for things like stents and knee replacements and those sort of category of prosthetic devices that get implanted in people when they have surgery. On the hospital side, there are all sorts of strange arrangements, including one which is called the second tier deal, which ensures that hospitals that don't enter into formal arrangements with individual health insurers have a sort of a fallback, a default position. They call it a safety net, but in my view, that safety net is too high, and as a result, it becomes a de facto floor, which is sort of also protecting or diminishing the impact of competition. And there are a number of other examples as well. But the whole sector is infected with, once you sort of lift the lid off it, you see there are a whole range of deals and little sub-deals that were entered into many years ago, often to deal with a small crisis or some issue, and which have never been able to be unravelled. And this is all sort of building up.
What about rising healthcare costs? Because this has been a confounding issue for 15 years.
Yeah, well, of course. That's the reality is private health inflation has been running at around 6%, maybe 5% in a good year for a very long time. And there's no real evidence that that's going to change. It's being driven by demographic factors. People are getting older and the services that they want are becoming more expensive. The population is getting bigger. So all these things are individually impacting on the pressure on the health system and obviously driving up costs. And those costs have to be borne somewhere along the system. So private health insurers are in a bit of a crosshair situation in terms of having to meet those costs.
So who do you reckon survives if this scenario plays out?
Look, a lot more than I think you said in your introduction.
Okay.
I think the outlook is nowhere near as gloomy as that. I'm not saying that it's fantastic, don't get me wrong. There are definitely pressures in the sector, but the reality is most of the insurers are very well capitalised. They've got a lot of money in reserve. In fact, the industry as a whole is about $7 billion in cash over and above the statutory requirement. A lot of that is held in the not-for-profit sector because, in the same way that Jeff Summerhays was saying yesterday, they can't go out to the market and raise money. They also have limitations on how they can spend their own money. So as a result, a lot of the not-for-profit funds have actually got this sort of nest egg that's been building up over the years, which they can draw upon. So I think, the outlook in 2 or 3 years' time is most of the insurers will still be there. I think APRA is definitely going to be putting pressure on more and more of them to look at what he's been calling Plan B, which is the merger option. And with 37 or whatever it is now, 36 or 37 funds out there, that's still far too many, obviously. And so there needs to be some consolidation. But there's no way in the world there's going to be 5 funds in 2 years' time.
Okay.
It's going to take a lot longer than that. Don't happen.
But bottom line, do you think there is any chance that we break out of this cycle of above inflation increases to people's private health insurance premiums over the medium term?
It's a huge challenge. My view is that the best way to deal with this ultimately is by putting more effective market forces into the whole sector. But that's a very challenging thing to do. Politicians are very reluctant to do that because the sector is full of powerful lobbies like the doctors and the private hospitals and the device manufacturers and all these other people that are protecting privileged positions. So whenever you step into that lion's den, most politicians emerge totally mauled by the experience and usually saying, I'm never going there again. So that's the difficulty that you encounter. There are some sensible proposals, which I think require, as I said, the clear-eyed input of an expert group who can actually tell the government without the influence of a whole bunch of lobbies trying to tilt the field one way or another into their own advantage, but they can get absolutely straight down the line advice about what's required and then find a government with the intestinal fortitude to actually step forward and make it happen. But, that's a big thing to say and very hard to do.
As they say in the classics, good luck with that.
Yes, indeed. And it's extraordinarily challenging.
Sure.
The government more or less knows what it needs to do.
Yeah, they just don't want to do it.
But it's not prepared to do it because it's too politically upsetting. So this is the situation in which we find ourselves.
Shaun, thank you. Appreciate you explaining it.
My pleasure, Gareth.
Shaun Gath, former head of Private Health Insurance Administration Council, with a prescription to cure some of the things that ail the private health industry. But will the patient be prepared to take the medicine? 922 11882. I do wonder how much more private health insurance, how much more expensive it can get before you drop it. If you've got any thoughts on it, you can email me mornings@6pr.com.au.